Hi, I'm Saydi Bowen,
And I'm Kennedy Call.
and this week we read A Search for Common Ground, Chapter 10 on Diversity and Equity. To start, so it's a conversation between Pedro and Rick, and they're talking about diversity and equity. And so to start, Pedro is kind of talking about how there has been a lot more immigration recently. And so now in America, there's a lot more Latino and and Asian populations that are now here. And so the schools are starting to become a lot more integrated than they were before. He's saying that the world, because it's more racially diverse, we need to make sure that all kids are getting a good education still, and we aren't being biased or anything towards one race, and that all kids are being treated equal. He also talks a lot about how it's really important to make sure we're including all kids' cultures in school and learning. And when we talk about history, we don't only talk about the American, white people who helped shape our nation, but also all the people from different cultures who really helped shape America, because there were a lot of them. He also talks about how white people are starting to become the minority more. There is starting to be, like I said earlier, a lot more diversity, and it's almost more than white. So we really do need to be sensitive about all the diversity going on.
Yeah. Some other things that Pedro talks about is how it's interesting to see how there's technically still segregation by race in the boundaries of the schools and the districts. How technically against the law it's no longer allowed, but how we can see that in our classrooms in the schools. And so we need to be careful of that and mindful that that is still around and that it is a thing, regardless of whether or not that's in the law. He also mentioned how kids that are born poor usually end up poor because of that. They're segregated into their own little circles based on their neighborhoods, and so they're surrounded by that and they don't really know anything different, and so we need to find ways to pull them out of that. I also talk about the number of white female teachers and how there needs to be more diversity in the teachers that we have, and how it's important for students to see other cultures represented in their educators as well, and so creating that balance. And then he also talked about how important it is to learn from the schools and education systems that are doing it right, that have successful students come out from these more diverse schools and cultures, and how we can learn from them to do better with that.
Yes, totally. And then Rick goes on to kind of talk about how action is required to make sure all of the students are getting a good equal education, because that is so important and we need them all to learn equally. And he also talks a lot about how people these days misinterpret equity and diversity, and they kind of go to extremes which aren't necessarily necessary with talking about any race. They kind of go to far extremes, and we need to be mindful that we can't go too far, when we're being we shouldn't ever be racist, but you can't be that is so white, talking about hard work or anything, because any culture can work hard or anything that. So that's really important. And I think he talks about how we really need to find common ground and goals to educate all students and give them an equal opportunity to learn, and for their cultures to be represented.
Yeah, and just going off of that, that was his big focus, was how we can't go to the extreme. He gave an example of how you wouldn't look at an Asian population and see their parents using the word hard work and say, wow, that's so white. How dare you say that the word hard work associated with a child. And so we need to make sure that we're not being extreme in the ways that we take it. We have to acknowledge that there are the issues, and that there is racism, and that there are needs for greater diversity, but that we have to be careful of not separating out specific things that we are trying to call separate them by race, like hard work or politeness, and stuff like that are positives, but that have some negative connotations based off of our history and how we can improve from that.
Yeah.
He also talked about how it's interesting how there's some rhetoric that we need women in STEM, and how there's too many men or in those, and we need to provide opportunities to the minorities. And in this case, he's talking about how the women were the minorities and how that would be adding diversity, but how he pointed out that actually now we are more diverse in that, and that 60% of college graduates are women, and a majority of the STEM degrees that are being earned are actually women, and how we've made that progress and how we need to acknowledge that progress, and also then take that into cultures and race as well, and try and make those changes as well and see the progress. And so he said that a big thing that stood out to me was that if an issue needs to be solved, it needs to be done with careful consideration, and we need to make sure that we have the respect for all parties involved, and that just we don't need to be super extreme either way. The goal is for everyone to feel loved, to feel accepted, to everyone have their story heard, and how important that story is. Yeah,
that's really important. Now for the praxis. In my classroom, I think one of the main things I'm going to make sure I do is, like mentioned before, just make sure everyone is getting an equal opportunity to learn, that I'm not treating any students differently or anything, but that all students get an equal chance to learn and to do what they want, so they all feel loved and equal. I also think it's really, really important that in my classroom all cultures are represented. So like when decorating, I want to make sure that I'm mindful of like everyone's different cultural and cultures and background, and I'm not prioritizing one race over the other, because we're all equal and all have the equal opportunity to learn. And so I think that's really important, and in my classroom it's going to be important that all races are celebrated and no one's feeling discriminated against.
Yeah. Similarly, in my classroom, I want to have an understanding of the cultures and unique backgrounds that my students come from, so that we can include those in our classroom, that we can see and celebrate that, like she said, so that I can greater understand how their culture affects them, and then we can all learn about that in not super obvious ways, by like pointing out a student and being like, they're not from America originally, but to help them understand their culture better and see that they're not as different. And I think that's really important. Also, in my classroom, I want to be able to acknowledge that there is unfairness and racism that does exist and has existed and continues to, and that we need to be better and do better. And so by acknowledging that in my classroom, we can be able to see all the perspectives and see the important figures that have impacted, that aren't always talked about, so that we can celebrate everyone's cultures and unique, diverse backgrounds.
And yeah, like you said, for the praxis, I do think, it's really important to not associate like, oh, because they're this race, that means they're poor, you know? So I do think it's really important to make sure, like you were saying, to really try to understand each kid in our classroom, like on an individual level, so you do know like what needs need to be met for your students in class.
And seeing the positives and trying to highlight that. Not drawing focus to negatives.
Totally. Now for the reflection. I think overall it was really just talking about how there is really becoming a lot more diversity now in the school systems. There's so many more races and people immigrating from other places, and so it is really important to pay attention to their cultures and to be mindful of them in the classroom, and to make sure that we're not tearing down other races and cultures, and just making sure everyone's equal and loved, and that we're mindful of everyone and their backgrounds.
In my reflection, I just kind of saw how there was, in the book, Rick and Pedro are technically arguing, but I felt like they really were arguing this time. And they felt very strongly about their one sides and felt like they had to nail their point. And so I was just thinking how important it is that we look outside of ourselves and from our point of view and perspective, and maybe try and see it from the other side. Rick could have better looked at it from Pedro's perspective and been able to understand the world better, and same with Pedro, he could have looked at Rick's better. And so when we try and proactively do that in our own lives, we're going to be able to better serve our students, because we'll be able to expand our beliefs and be able to incorporate and realize that there's probably somewhere in the middle that's more reality, and being able to gain that equity and equality and diversity that's so needed for a positive society.
Yeah, that's great.
Thanks.